This example gives us an opportunity to strengthen our understanding of what it means to over or under allocate manufacturing overhead. So in this particular situation, the T account shows the manufacturing overhead activity for Edith Corp. We have a $205,000 debit and a $209,000 credit. The text asks us, what is the total actual manufacturing overhead? Well, remember, as we discussed, actual overhead is debited to manufacturing overhead as it is incurred. So debits in manufacturing overhead are actually what we have spent. We actually spent $205,000 in manufacturing overhead. What did we allocate? Well, if you'll remember, when we debit manufacturing overhead for what we actually spend, but we credit manufacturing overhead as it moves out of manufacturing overhead and into the work in process account. So for example, in this particular situation, see if I can show you here, the $209,000 would actually move out of manufacturing overhead and into a work in process account. Right? So if you'll go back to our illustration and the chapter as we're working on this, manufacturing overhead at some point is allocated using a predetermined overhead rate to take it out of manufacturing overhead and into the work in process account. This is our allocation. Okay, so the text asks us, is this manufacturing overhead under allocated or has it been over allocated, and by how much? Once again, you've got to reason through these illustrations, not simply memorize. The chart in your book and in your PowerPoint slide is great for illustration purposes, but you need to think through this. If I spent $205,000 in overhead, but I moved $209,000 into work in process, and where does it go after work in process? Remember, it goes to finished goods. And where does it go after finished goods? It goes to cost of goods sold. So even though I only spent $205,000 on manufacturing overhead, I moved $209,000 into work in process, then to finished goods, and then into cost of goods sold. So at this point, cost of goods sold has too much overhead. That means we have over allocated overhead. I've put $209,000 into my cost of goods sold account when in reality I've only spent $205,000. So my cost of goods sold is overstated. And so I have over allocated overhead. And what am I going to do to correct that? Okay, if you'll remember from the illustrations in the text, I've put $4,000 too much into cost of goods sold. So I have to reduce cost of goods sold. Also, I need this account to be zero. In order to get this account to zero, I have $4,000 too much in the credit side. So I need to debit manufacturing overhead. So if I debit it by $4,000, I need to credit something else. What am I going to credit? I'm going to credit cost of goods sold for the same amount. Why? Let me correct that. Okay, because I have $209,000 in cost of goods sold when it should only have $205,000. Okay, so I hope this helps to give you an illustration of actual overhead is a debit to overhead. The credit is what we have actually allocated to our product. If I have more credits than debits, I have over allocated. I have put too much overhead into work in process, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. And I have to adjust it. How do I adjust it? By decreasing cost of goods sold and putting it back into the manufacturing overhead account. On the other hand, which zeroes it out, okay, if I would have had more manufacturing, if I would have had a debit, let's say $209,000 in manufacturing overhead versus $204,000 taken out, then I did not take out enough. And if I did not take out enough, I have under-allocated overhead. I have not put enough in work in process, in finished goods, in cost of goods sold, and my correction is going to be right the opposite. I would need to increase my cost of goods sold for the overhead that should have gotten there and didn't. Okay, I hope this is a good review for you and what happens when we have to adjust our estimated manufacturing overhead allocations that we have made to get them to the actual amount at the end of the period.